Early February 1942, Washington, D.C. A bitter wind clawed its way between the columns of the War Department, carrying the taste of iron and smoke. The city lights were dimmed by blackout orders, and the night seemed heavier for it, dense with the weight of decisions that would shape the world. Henry Caldwell stood on the marble steps beneath a flickering lantern, his breath forming pale ghosts in the cold. In his gloved hands he held a folder marked Classified, Aircraft Production Board. The paper inside still smelled of fresh ink, but the command it carried already felt older than time. * 50,000 planes a year, *. He didn't move for a long while. Through the snow he could hear the arguments still raging inside. The colonels, the factory men, the bureaucrats who thought numbers like these belonged in fairy tales, not blueprints. 50,000. The figure rolled through his mind like thunder. It wasn't just an order. It was a prophecy, either of salvation or of madness. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Hermann Göring was laughing. The American intercept men had caught the broadcast, the Luftwaffe chief's voice crackling through static, thick with mockery. America, he'd said. They can't even build cars without chrome. They'll build 50,000 planes when pigs fly. That laughter had found its way into the New York Times by morning, bold ink and cold derision. Henry had folded the clipping and tucked it into his wallet, the way soldiers carried photographs of home. Every time he touched it, he felt the sneer burn against his skin. 2 days later he was aboard a Pullman train bound for Michigan, watching the world blur past in gray ribbons of frost and smoke. The Capitol dome disappeared behind him like a fading ember. The wheels clattered in a steady rhythm that reminded him of the assembly lines back home in Detroit, steady, relentless, human. He pressed a hand against the window, feeling the cold bite through the glass. If Göring doubts us, he thought, he'll choke on the sky we're about to fill. When the train hissed to a stop at Ypsilanti Station, the air cut like a blade. The land before him stretched wide and white, a plain of frozen farmland soon to become something the world had never seen. Willow Run. A name that would one day sound like a promise. For now, it was mud and snow and a handful of Ford engineers huddled around a potbelly stove, warming their hands and muttering about madness. Henry stepped into the wind, his boots sinking into thawing earth. There were no hangars yet, no runway, just the echo of engines from trucks and bulldozers that roared through the dark. The sky was gray with smoke from burning brush, the scent of oil and pine heavy in the air. He joined the men at the drafting tables, where the plans for the mile-long factory were spread out like maps to a new world. They drank coffee gone cold before it could be swallowed and argued about tolerances and conveyor speeds until dawn. Each telegram from the front was a nail driven into their hearts. The fall of the Philippines, U-boats strangling the Atlantic, Britain crying for help. The news clattered through the plant like rivets against steel. But still the number hung above them like a commandment written in fire: 50,000 planes a year. One night, the wind screamed through the unfinished arches, carrying flakes of snow into their lantern light. Joe Daly, the foreman, stood with his collar up, smoke from his cigarette curling around his face. "We'll be lucky if we hit 10,000, he muttered, half to himself. Henry didn't look up from his drawing board. His pencil trembled in his hand, more from exhaustion than cold. "We'll build 50,000, he said, voice low but steady. "Then 50,000 more." Daly laughed softly, shaking his head, but something in Henry's tone silenced him. It wasn't bravado. It was belief. March came, and the first thaw turned the fields into rivers of mud. Trucks bogged down. Welders cursed through chattering teeth. And yet, out of that mire, steel began to rise. Arches taller than any barn curved against the sky, their outlines glowing orange in the dawn. Day by day, the skeleton of a giant took shape. Henry slept little. He lived on bread, coffee, and adrenaline. Sometimes he'd wake at his drafting desk to find a thin layer of frost on the blueprints. Once, he dreamed of planes made of glass, so many that they darkened the sun. When he told Daly, the man just grinned. "Keep dreaming, Caldwell. We'll need every one of those ghosts to scare Göring back to Berlin." By April, the noise of construction could be heard 10 miles away. Steam shovels groaned, hammers clanged, and the air hummed with power. Reporters came and went, calling it Ford's folly. They wrote that no one could build bombers the way you built cars. But Henry saw something different. He saw lines, assembly lines stretching across time itself, from the blacksmith's hammer to the age of the sky. When the first section of roof was sealed, he climbed the scaffolding at dawn to watch the sun pour through the beams. The light hit the steel and flared like gold. For a moment he forgot the war. It felt like creation itself, the birth of something vast and unstoppable. By June, the first assembly bays gleamed with new machinery. Ford's men from River Rouge brought in stamping presses the size of cottages, cranes that could lift entire fuselages, and conveyor belts that crawled like living veins across the floor. The air smelled of oil, steel, and human sweat. One morning, the engineers gathered around a test wing, its aluminum skin polished to a mirror's sheen. The model, B-24 Liberator, was enormous, 110 feet of wingspan and promise. Henry ran his gloved hand across the riveted seams, tracing each line as if it were scripture. "This is what freedom looks like," he whispered. Outside, snowmelt ran in silver rivulets beneath the half-built hangar. Beyond the horizon, the world was burning. Stalingrad, Manila, Singapore. The war devoured everything in its path. But in this corner of Michigan, something was stirring. The workers came in waves. Men from shuttered auto plants, women from the farms, teenagers barely old enough to shave. They arrived by trainloads, carrying lunch pails and faith. The factory floor filled with a hum unlike any sound on earth. 1,000 voices, 1,000 machines, 1,000 dreams colliding in steel. At night, Henry would climb to the roof, where the wind bit hard and the stars seemed close enough to touch. Below him stretched the skeleton of Willow Run. A mile of light and shadow, a living artery pulsing with purpose. In the distance, the lights of Detroit flickered faintly, a constellation of industry. He thought of Göring then, sitting in some Berlin palace, drunk on power and mockery. He wondered if the man could imagine what was being born here, if he could picture the hands that shaped it, the machinist with oil in her hair, the farmer's son learning to weld, the woman from Toledo who swung a rivet gun as if she'd been born to it. Sometimes, when the generators shut down at midnight and silence fell, Henry could almost hear the future in the rafters, the roar of engines yet unbuilt, the steady beat of propellers over endless seas. By the time the Robins returned to Michigan, spring had painted the fields green again. The snow was gone, but the mud remained, a reminder of where they'd begun. And in that mud, surrounded by cranes and scaffolds and the smell of hot steel, the dream had taken form. Before the war, Henry Caldwell had lived a life of precision and rhythm. Every morning he'd rise before dawn, shave by the faint hum of his wife's radio, and drive through Detroit's gray mist to the Ford River Rouge plant. There, in the great cathedral of industry, he spent his days designing stamping dies for car doors. It was honest, unremarkable work. Numbers, tolerances, smooth lines of steel pressed into shape beneath machines that thundered like gods. He loved the order of it, the predictability. The world, to him, was a blueprint waiting to be drawn. Then came December 7, 1941. He was at the plant that Sunday, finishing an overtime shift, when a foreman burst into the drafting room, his face drained of color. "Pearl Harbor," he said. "The Japs hit Pearl." The radio crackled to life, voices trembling with disbelief, the words, "battleships burning," and "casualties unknown," hanging in the air like smoke. Within hours, Detroit changed. Posters went up overnight. Men lined at enlistment offices. And the steady rhythm of automobile production shattered under a new drumbeat: war. Henry walked home through the falling snow that night, his breath fogging in the cold. He passed silent assembly lines, the lights dimmed for blackout precautions. For the first time, the city felt vulnerable, mortal. His brother, Tom, a merchant sailor, was already at sea. When the news of U-boat attacks came weeks later, Henry's stomach twisted each time the radio mentioned a torpedoed freighter. Then one morning, the telegram arrived. Asterisk vessel unaccounted for in North Atlantic. All hands presumed lost. Asterisk there was no body to bury, no grave to visit, just a hollow ache and a silence that stretched like the ocean itself. From that moment, the war was no longer distant or political. It had entered his blood. In early 1942, the call went out from Ford's headquarters. The government wanted an aircraft factory unlike anything the world had seen, mass production of bombers on an automobile scale. They needed engineers willing to abandon routine and reinvent the impossible. When the notice reached River Rouge, Henry didn't hesitate. He packed his blueprints, kissed his mother on the forehead, and took the first train to Ypsilanti. The early months were chaos. The B-24 Liberator was a monster of a machine, a web of over 1 million parts. The blueprints arrived from Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego by courier plane, rolled and creased, sometimes rewritten entirely before last week's designs were even tested. Steel shipments jammed in Chicago yards. Rubber, aluminum, and ball bearings vanished into other contracts. It felt like trying to build a cathedral out of sand while the tide came in. Henry threw himself into the work anyway. He believed, with almost religious fervor, that this war would not be won by generals but by men like him, engineers, machinists, welders. He believed that victory would rise from the ground up, forged in the din of factories and the sweat of ordinary hands. Every day he walked the floor, clipboard in hand, coat stained with grease, sleeves rolled high. The air in the half-built plant smelled of hot metal and ambition. Women from Ypsilanti in kerchiefs stood beside farmers' sons from Ohio, learning to rivet wings, calibrate gauges, polish plexiglass canopies. They were strangers united by a single purpose: to fill the sky with American planes until no shadow of the Reich remained. 50,000, one mechanic said once, shaking his head at the posted number on the wall. They really think we can do that? Henry smiled faintly. We don't have to think, he replied. We just have to start. He worked through nights that stretched like lifetimes. Some evenings, when the plant lights dimmed and the last shift dragged itself home, he'd climb the metal stairs to the catwalk that overlooked the line. Below him, sparks flared and died in slow rhythm, a constellation of effort flickering in the gloom. The noise settled into his bones, the clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, the murmured laughter of women who refused to quit. In the evenings, he'd return to his boarding room, a narrow space above a bakery that smelled perpetually of yeast and sweat. He kept the radio on low, its static mixing with the ticking of pipes. Some nights, he'd catch German broadcasts on shortwave, Göring speeches, full of swagger and contempt. The Luftwaffe chief's voice came through distorted but unmistakable, his tone dripping with arrogance. America is a land of merchants, Göring declared once. Soft men. They will drown in their own abundance before they build even half of what they claim. Henry tightened the valve on his radiator until it screamed. His jaw clenched so hard it hurt. That night he sat at his desk and unfolded the telegram about Tom. He read it again and again until the letters blurred. Then he whispered into the dark, "We'll see about that." By late 1942, the monster was awake. Willow Run had grown into a city of its own, 30,000 workers moving in 3 endless shifts, 7 days a week. The parking lots stretched beyond sight. Cafeterias fed thousands at a time. Their lines smelled of coffee, soup, and gasoline. On the factory floor, the noise never ceased, riveting guns hammering in staccato rhythm, conveyor belts grinding, loudspeakers crackling with big band songs meant to keep morale alive. Henry began carrying earplugs of waxed cotton. Even so, the roar found its way inside him. It became the pulse of his days, the heartbeat of an America determined to prove itself. He could see it in every face. The girl from Indiana whose hands were calloused from milking cows now shaped the frames of bomb bay doors. The old mechanic who once fixed Model Ts now balanced instruments delicate as watch gears. Each day they worked faster, smarter, more synchronized. The factory felt alive, breathing, relentless. Sometimes reporters visited. They'd wander through with cameras, notebooks, wide eyes. They always asked the same thing: "Do you think it's possible?" Henry would shrug. "It's already happening." When the exhaustion became unbearable, he'd write to his mother back in Dearborn. His letters were short but steady, written in the same firm hand he used for blueprints. "We're not fighting with rifles here, Ma. We're fighting with wrenches. Every bolt we tighten is one less boy who dies in France." He never mentioned Tom, but she always read between the lines. Autumn brought long nights and bitter winds that seeped through the cracks in the great hangar doors. The workers bundled themselves in scarves and gloves, breath fogging in the light of the overhead lamps. When snow began to fall outside, Henry watched it drift past the glass panes, glowing faintly under the yard lights. The flakes reminded him of sparks, millions of small fires against the dark. April 1943 came with the sound of hammers that never stopped. The Michigan spring thawed the last crusts of snow, and with it, the miracle began to take shape. The great hangars of Willow Run, once skeletal frames of steel, now pulsed with motion and noise, a living organism made of iron, sweat, and faith. From above, the assembly line looked like a river of silver, flowing steady and certain toward the light. And down that river moved the B-24 Liberator, America's promise of vengeance and endurance. Henry Caldwell walked the line each morning before the whistles blew. His clipboard was tucked under his arm, his boots slick with oil, his eyes tracing every motion with the vigilance of a priest watching over sacred ritual. He'd once seen men build cars in this same way, but this was different. The B-24 wasn't a machine, it was a message. Every rivet, every bolt was a syllable in the sentence that would be read aloud in the skies above Europe. He paused near Station 17, where Rosie from Indiana guided her rivet gun with the precision of a surgeon. The gun hissed and barked, the metal trembling under her hands. Her scarf was stained with grease, her eyes sharp with focus. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," she called over the roar. "Morning, Rosie," he answered. "How many rivets today?" "As many as it takes," she shouted back, smiling through exhaustion. He moved on to where Bill from Detroit knelt beneath a half-finished fuselage, testing hydraulic lines. Bill had worked at the Rouge plant before the war, his hands more familiar with brake lines than bomb racks. "Pressure steady," Bill said without looking up. "You'd think these pipes had blood in them." Henry smiled faintly. "They do. Yours." At the next bay, old Ed from Ohio buffed a plexiglass nose cone until it gleamed like ice. He was past 60, his back bent, his breath heavy. Yet he polished each inch as if the war itself depended on the shine. All around them, the air vibrated with motion. Hoists rising, engines rumbling, radios crooning Glenn Miller beneath the hammering of steel. At full speed, Willow Run could produce one bomber every 63 minutes. 63 minutes to turn raw metal into a creature that could cross an ocean. Henry kept records of everything. He filled notebook after notebook with diagrams, figures, and tiny notes only he could decipher. Pratt & Whitney are 1830 engines, 2,700 horsepower each, wingspan, 110 feet, armament, 4 Browning .50 caliber guns, facts and numbers, yet to him they read like poetry. Each figure carried the echo of a heartbeat. Some nights, after the final whistle blew, he'd climb to the observation deck overlooking the entire line. Below him, the final assembly stretched into the distance, lit by arc lamps that turned the air silver. He'd watch a completed bomber roll toward the hangar doors, its propellers still, its skin gleaming. Workers would stand aside as if saluting something alive. Then the engines would cough, sputter, roar, and the sound would shake the floor beneath his boots. When the first B-24 rolled out of Willow Run, reporters swarmed the plant. Life magazine photographers climbed scaffolds to capture the moment. Army Signal Corps men snapped images for Washington. The flashbulbs popped like artillery, catching faces slick with sweat and pride. "America builds a bomber an hour," the headlines would read. But the photographs couldn't capture the smell, the hot tang of oil and aluminum, the ozone sting of welding torches, the human scent of endurance. Henry sent copies of the photos to his mother, wrapping them in brown paper with a note. "We're getting there." She wrote back that she'd pinned one to the wall beside Tom's picture. In Berlin, Göring saw those same images in foreign papers. He dismissed them as propaganda tricks, a bluff for American morale. "Let them make their toys," he was reported to have said. "The Luftwaffe will swat them from the sky." But the sky itself was changing. By summer, the liberators began their journey eastward, across Canada, over the icy span of the Atlantic, through the winds of Iceland, down into England's grey fields. Operation Bolero had begun. The first time Henry heard the news, he stood silent, staring at the bulletin pinned to the factory board. The words blurred, and for the first time in months, he exhaled a long, trembling breath. Those planes weren't just metal, they were answers. A few weeks later, a letter arrived addressed simply to Henry Caldwell, Willow Run Plant. The envelope bore the U.S. Army Air Force's insignia. Inside, written in a hand rough with fatigue, were the words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Tell your crew we trust those rivets more than prayer." The signature was illegible, the name smeared by rain, but Henry didn't need to know the man. He could see him clearly, a pilot somewhere over the Atlantic, fingers white on the controls, IB-24 shuddering through flak and cloud. He read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his wallet beside Göring's mocking article. Two opposites pressed together, doubt and proof. That evening he stayed late. The shift had ended, the floor empty but for the hum of cooling engines. Outside, the runway lights cut through the dusk in long golden lines. A newly finished Liberator stood at the edge of the tarmac, its silver body reflecting the last embers of sunset. Painted on its nose in bold blue letters were the words "Spirit of Michigan." Henry walked toward it slowly, the gravel crunching under his boots. He ran his hand along the smooth fuselage, feeling the vibration of the idling engines beneath the skin. Mechanics shouted final checks, their voices lost beneath the rising roar. Then the plane began to move, lumbering forward, faster, faster, until its wheels left the ground. He tilted his head back, eyes following the bomber as it rose into the copper sky. For a heartbeat, it seemed suspended there, weightless, eternal. Then it banked, turned, and disappeared into the clouds. The field fell silent. Henry stood there long after the last echo faded, the smell of exhaust hanging in the air. A gust of wind caught his coat, and he whispered the name painted on the plane again, softly this time. Spirit of Michigan. He thought of the men who would fly it, boys who might never see home again. He thought of Rosie, Bill, and Ed, of the thousands who had poured their strength into this miracle of motion. None of them would ever pull a trigger or drop a bomb, yet each of them had already fought a battle and won. That night, as he walked back through the factory's echoing halls, he realized what war had become. It was no longer just trenches and uniforms, no longer fought by generals and front lines. It was fought in places like this, in the rhythm of hammers, in the patience of workers, in the unbroken will of a nation that refused to stop. The Reich had built terror. America had built endurance. And endurance, Henry thought as he looked up at the smoke-stained rafters, would outlast every empire that mocked it. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of another engine climbing into the sky, steady and sure. He stood for a moment, listening to the hum fade into the dark, and knew that somewhere across the ocean, the world was already beginning to change. Snow fell soft as ash over the airfield, gathering in pale drifts against the hangar doors. Inside, the factory breathed and labored like a living thing. The night shift moved through pools of yellow light, their shadows long and slow across the concrete floor. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and metal, the sharp tang of ozone from welding torches. Outside, the wind howled, but within Willow Run there was only the rhythm of creation, the heartbeat of America's arsenal in its most silent hour. It was Christmas Eve, 1943. The clocks glowed past 11. Most men had gone home, back to families waiting with rationed suppers and thin Christmas trees. But hundreds of women remained, Rosie from Indiana, Helen from Ypsilanti, the farmer's wife from Lenawee County, working through the cold to finish the final run of 50 bombers due before the new year. Henry Caldwell made his way down the assembly line, carrying a dented tray of thermoses filled with hot coffee. Steam rose from the lids and curled into the frozen air. He handed them out one by one, his hands trembling not from the cold but from exhaustion. "Careful, it's hot," he said, his voice hoarse. Rosie was there, standing atop a crate, her sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a red scarf now blackened by grease. The rivet gun hissed and barked in her grip. Between shots, she hummed "Silent Night," the tune barely audible above the air compressors. Across the hangar, someone had tied a thin string of tinsel around a bomber's tail fin. The silver caught the light, shimmering like frost against the dull green paint. Henry paused near the nose of a nearly finished B-24, its windows fogged by the chill. "How many left?" he asked one of the foremen. "7, came the reply. "If the hydraulics hold." "They'll hold," Henry murmured. He moved on, boots echoing faintly, each step a metronome to the work around him. Near midnight, the factory's loudspeakers crackled with static. The foreman was about to announce the end of the shift when a voice broke through, soft, high, and trembling. It sang, unaccompanied, fragile as breath. "I'll be home for Christmas." The sound drifted across the hangar like smoke. The voice belonged to a child, a little girl standing on a crate beside her father's workbench, clutching the microphone in both hands. Her coat sleeves were too long, her curls dusted with snow. The welder beside her froze mid-motion, his torch sputtering out as he looked up in disbelief. One by one, the machines quieted. The rivet guns ceased their staccato rhythm. The conveyor belts slowed, the humming air compressors stilled. The entire hangar seemed to hold its breath. The girl's voice trembled on the high notes, but it carried, pure, untrained, and achingly human. "You can plan on me. Please have snow and mistletoe." Henry stopped where he stood. The coffee tray hung forgotten at his side. His eyes closed, and for a moment the factory dissolved. He was no longer in Michigan but on a harbor pier in 1941, watching his younger brother, Tom, in a merchant navy uniform waving from the deck of a freighter. He could still smell the salt, hear the low drone of the ship's engines. The same engines that had fallen silent somewhere in the North Atlantic, swallowed by U-boat torpedoes and darkness. A tear broke loose, sliding down through the soot on his face. He didn't wipe it away. The song went on, each word a knife and a comfort both. "I'll be home for Christmas, if only in my dreams." When the girl reached the final note, her voice wavered, then faded into the great silence. For several seconds, no one moved. The lights hummed overhead. Somewhere near the far end of the hangar, a woman began to cry quietly, her hands pressed against her mouth. The old farmer, took off his cap and held it against his chest. Then, one by one, the workers turned back to their stations. No one spoke. The machines came alive again, not with the frantic urgency of the night before, but with something steadier, deeper. It was no longer duty that guided them. It was love, grief, and the shared ache of absence. Henry walked slowly down the aisle, past the glowing engines and the half-assembled fuselages. The music lingered in his ears like the echo of a prayer. Every face he passed looked different now, drawn but resolute, lit by the same quiet fire. He stopped beside Rosie, who was wiping her eyes with her sleeve before putting her goggles back on. "She's got a beautiful voice," Henry said softly. Rosie nodded. "Her father says she sings every night at home. He brought her here so she wouldn't be alone." Henry glanced at the clock. 12:03 am Christmas Day. "None of us are alone," he said, though the words caught in his throat. Hours blurred together. Outside, the snow thickened, falling in dense curtains that turned the world white. Inside, the roar of work resumed, rivets biting metal, engines humming under test, men and women moving in sync as if guided by one unseen conductor. Just before dawn, a whistle blew. The final bomber rolled forward, its landing gear glinting under the lamps. The workers gathered around as it inched toward the hangar doors, steam curling from its exhaust. Someone brought out a brush and a can of white paint. On the metal just beneath the cockpit, Rosie knelt and began to write in slow, careful strokes, "For every brother lost." Henry stood beside her, his breath fogging in the cold, watching the letters take form. The words shimmered in the light, stark against the olive-green fuselage. When she finished, she looked up at him and smiled faintly. "That one's yours, Mr. Caldwell." He nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the first gray of morning was breaking over the snowbound runway. The hangar doors groaned open, and the wind swept in, sharp and clean. The bomber rolled out into the light, its propellers spinning, slicing the air with the sound of thunder. Henry walked to the edge of the tarmac. The cold burned his cheeks, the snow stinging his eyes. As the aircraft began to taxi, he whispered under his breath, "Merry Christmas, Tom." Then, after a pause, quieter still, "Merry Christmas, Göring." The Liberator gathered speed, its wheels throwing up snow and ice. Then, with a rush of wind and sound, it lifted from the ground, climbing into the pale morning sky. The rising sun struck its wings, turning them gold. For a moment, it looked less like a machine and more like a promise, shining, defiant, eternal. Henry stood there long after it disappeared into the clouds. The snow fell harder, blurring the runway, softening the scars of industry. Behind him, the workers cheered faintly, their voices carried away by the wind. He didn't turn back. He kept his eyes on the empty sky, the echo of the engines fading like a heartbeat into distance. Somewhere above that gray horizon, he imagined the bomber's name gleaming beneath the cockpit, its message written for all to see. For every brother lost. And for the first time since the war began, Henry felt not just pride, but peace.